as we were singing the first hymn, which is one of my favorites, the God of grace and God of glory. That first verse always gives me a little bit of trouble, though, as we sing it at the beginning of the worship hour, because it's grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour. So hopefully we have all of that. The text this morning is from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, the 3rd chapter of the story. It's the story of Joseph. We are going to read from the last chapter in Genesis, beginning with the 15th verse. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This is the word of the Lord. Our story today is the story of Joseph. Now, you know the story. I'm going to hit the pattern of this. I don't want to retell the story, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights. The first thing that I want us to see is that when we first are introduced to Joseph, he's 17 years old. He's a bit immature. He's the favored son. He had the coat with the long sleeves, which is what Steve read from the NRSV. If you grew up reading another version like I did, you would know it was the coat of many colors. Same thing. Coat, it was a fabulous coat, a wonderful coat. And Joseph sort of flaunted the fact that he was the favorite son of the father. He was the youngest of 11 brothers. Not only did he wear the coat around, kind of showing off, he had a dream. He had a couple of dreams about how the brothers, it could be interpreted as how the brothers and even the father would someday bow down to him. No wonder his brothers sold him into slavery. My gosh, what an arrogant little so-and-so. He was just immature. But then as we go along in the story, we find that it's really a great character story of how Joseph's character developed over the years. We know that he was sold into slavery. He was sold to a man named Potiphar. He went up the ladder in the household of Potiphar, became the estate manager, then, through no fault of his own, was falsely accused and ended up in jail. Right down to the bottom. And then back up, because the jailer could see that God had blessed Joseph. And so we find that Joseph was put in charge of the jail. The biblical text says that nothing happened in the jail unless Joseph did it. So Joseph became in charge of the jail. And then he had the opportunity to visit with two of the Pharaoh's personal servants. One was the cupbearer and one was the baker. These are two people who had intimate relationship with the Pharaoh because they were involved in feeding him. The cupbearer was the one who made sure that nobody poisoned the wine. The baker, of course, had all kinds of opportunity to betray the Pharaoh. And Joseph was able to interpret their dreams for them. In the cupbearer's case, the dream was a favorable dream. The cupbearer was going to be released and sent back to the Pharaoh. Not so good news for the baker. But then Joseph asked the cupbearer, after interpreting the dream, and after making it clear that it was God's gift to him that he could interpret the dream. Dreams, Joseph told the two, are God's. They don't belong to any human. They're God's. So Joseph didn't even take credit for the interpretation. But it came true, and so he asked the cupbearer to tell the Pharaoh about Joseph, so that the Pharaoh would find favor with Joseph. Well, again, a letdown, because it took 2 years for the cupbearer to remember Joseph. And he did so in the context of the Pharaoh's dreams. And you know the dreams about the 7 good years and the 7 bad years. What interests me about the story is Joseph's resilience, his character. He didn't just overnight become the second in command in Egypt. The Pharaoh put him there after the dream was interpreted. And actually, it wasn't the interpretation of the dream that got Joseph his job. It was the fact that Joseph had a plan and told the Pharaoh what the plan should be to be able to deal with the 7 bad years. So the Pharaoh thought, well, gee, if God has given this man this kind of wisdom to interpret the dream and conceive of the plan, maybe we should stick with him. So Joseph rose to the top. The pattern. Joseph rises up and then out of no fault of his own is knocked down. He rises back up and then through no fault of his own, the knees are knocked out from under him. How does a man do that? What was it about Joseph? What was it about him and his character that allowed him to be able to get up off the ground after being knocked down through no fault of his own? Well, I want to suggest 3 things that help Joseph, three aspects of his character that allowed Joseph to be able to consistently and persistently get back up. The first is that Joseph was able, he learned this, he was able to separate himself from his circumstances. In other words, Joseph did not allow his circumstances to be dictated, or his circumstances to dictate his character. He was able to separate his selfhood from the fact that he was in dire circumstances. Now, some of you are looking at me puzzled. In other words, Joseph did not allow his circumstances to dictate his response to the world. He did not become his circumstances. This past week, I saw on the internet a story about a young man and it caught my eye because I remembered the story from years ago. The young man's name is Brian Banks. Now, you probably don't know Brian Banks. He's not a household word. But Brian Banks was 15 years old. He was a football player at Polytechnic High School in Long Beach, California. He was a star football player at 15. Pete Carroll, who was then the head coach at University of Southern California, saw Brian Banks play. And after he saw him play, he walked up to this young man and said, "You can do something. You can be something." Now, of course, Brian Banks thought that Pete Carroll was talking about his football future, and he was. But that wasn't the prophecy that Carroll gave to Brian. 2 years later, at 17, when he was graduating from high school, Brian Banks had, half the colleges in the country recruiting him. He was the top recruited linebacker of his class. He had an oral commitment to go to USC to play football. That was his dream, to play football. And then he was falsely accused of rape. He got ensnared in the legal system, which stole 10 years of his life. He served 5 years in prison. He served 5 years on probation. And while he was still on probation, a private detective was able to capture his accuser, Brian Banks' accuser, on tape, admitting that she had lied, that she had falsely accused him. And she said that she wanted to help him, but she didn't want to have to give the $1.5 million back that she had won in a lawsuit against the school board. A year, but immediate, our legal system. Within a year, Brian Banks was exonerated. He then was able to go pursue his dream of being in professional football. Well, by this time, Brian Banks is 29 years old, and he's trying out. He got several tryouts with several professional football teams, and he's beginning to realize that his football career may not be as bright as he had hoped it was. He tried out for Pete Carroll at the Seattle Seahawks, and he also tried out and got on the roster, the 70-man roster before they cut it at the Atlantic Falcons. And there, right before the first game, when they were cutting back to 53 players, Banks was eliminated. But he got a call from Roger Goodell. Goodell wanted him to come and talk to the new class of 2014 draftees for the professional football league. And he came and gave a speech to them, and he so impressed them that a few weeks later, Roger Goodell called him back and hired him at the NFL. And today, Brian Banks is living out his dream of being in professional football, just not as a player. But he serves as a mentor and a motivational speaker for the league. He may very well be more valuable today, given the league's history in the last couple of years of abuse and so forth. Brian Banks may be more valuable today than he would have ever been as a player. Now, he's often asked the question of just how do you feel about the woman who accused you? And his response, and I'm just going to read some of this. His response is, I often think about what I've been through. I've removed my emotion from what this girl did to me. It already happened. It's, what am I doing now? How am I dealing with it? A lot of how he's dealing with it comes from the months that he spent in juvenile detention before his trial. He met a man there named Jerome Johnson, who became a mentor to him. Banks says this of Jerome Johnson. He opened my eyes. He challenged my mind in a way that had never been challenged before. I had a good upbringing, but these were things that were foreign to me. All it took was that person to introduce me to thinking who the real you is. Banks had never really understood his identity outside of football. He was a football player, and that's all he needed, which is the way many athletes are in high school. But then football was taken away from him. And he found himself in circumstances over which he had absolutely no control. And so the challenge for him became separating his selfhood from his circumstances. He said this, "One day I woke up and it dawned on me I had no control over what's going on in my life. I have control over how it affects me. I started to better myself as a person rather than to let my situation be the end all. I practiced it, and then it became a little easier." So Brian Banks learned how to separate his selfhood from his circumstances. That's the first thing that I think helped Joseph get through his life and rise up in the face of just awful circumstances. The second thing is that he developed a sense of humility. And some of that is just normal maturation, but certainly his experience with his brothers helped him to realize that humility is a strong asset as opposed to the arrogance that he displayed when we first met him. So Joseph was able in his lifetime to take his experience, and he developed this sense of humility. When you read the biblical text, you find out that whenever Joseph was involved and as he rose to the top, he didn't take the credit for that. The credit was God's. He gave God all the credit, even when he was talking, and maybe especially when he was talking to the Pharaoh. He told the Pharaoh, "This is God's doing. I can interpret. I've got a gift that's God's gift. I don't own it. It belongs to God." So Joseph developed this sense of humility throughout his lifetime. And along with the humility goes his willingness to forgive. Joseph, we saw in that last scene that I read, when his brothers came to and were afraid because their father had died, and they just knew Joseph was then going to take revenge. But he didn't. Joseph reassured them. Not only did he not take revenge, he said, "Don't worry, I will make sure that you have a life here in Egypt with me. I will make sure your children have a life here." There's no record or any indication in the biblical text that Joseph ever took revenge on people that he could have well been justified taking revenge on. Not his brothers, not Potiphar, not Potiphar's wife. So Joseph learned the formula, if you would, for rising above one's circumstances. And one of those things is, don't get caught up on the people that you perceive as having done you wrong. Forgive and then move on. It seems to me that this chapter in the story is just a great character study of a man that we know, it's almost a household name, Joseph. And I would encourage you to take the time, if you haven't already, to sit down and read the story carefully. There's a lot to know and a lot to learn from Joseph